So welcome everyone. I'm Carolyn Eswine with School of Architecture and Urban Planning, and welcome to the Innovative Cities lecture today. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. You'll see on the screen that we have a couple resources for you if you're interested in gathering additional information. We feel it's important as planners who are working to create more equitable communities that we share resources and deepen our knowledge and connections with Indigenous communities. So welcome again to the Innovative Cities lecture today. We're joined by Dr. Michael Mehaffy from Arizona State University, who's actually joining us from Paris today. So thank you for joining us. He will be presenting the new urban agenda for next generation cities. I will encourage you, if you have thoughts, comments, or questions, to please type them in the chat during his presentation. On some occasions I'll interject, otherwise we will wait till he finishes. We will be completed entirely by 1:15. He'll wrap up around 1, so we have time for discussion and questions. We will have a survey at the end, so you can give us ideas for other speakers or topics that you'd like to hear about. And a reminder that our next Innovative Cities lecture will be online. That's April 6th. It's housing advocacy and how to overcome housing NIMBYism. And then our Cause Your lecture will be in person on Friday, April 22nd. We're really excited to have Andre Broomfield coming to join us at 3:30 that afternoon. His topic is the 20-minute city through the lens of equity. So I would like to welcome Michael again, and we look forward to his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you guys very much for the invitation, and greetings from Paris. I actually am here to get ready for a conference that we're going to be doing on, well, their version of it is the 15-minute city. You may have heard Carlos Moreno, who's a professor at the Sorbonne here, has been the sort of pioneer of that, and he's going to be speaking at our conference, International Making Cities Livable, May 18th through 20th. So I'm here to get prepared for that conference, and then I'm also going to speak at another conference in the Netherlands tomorrow. So doing a little bit of running around, but obviously enjoying this wonderful city. So what I'm going to do, as the title suggests, is I'm going to talk about the new urban agenda. You probably know, many of you probably know a little bit about the new urban agenda, which is I think it's a big deal in our field because it has been adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries of the United Nations. And what it has in it is an outcome document of Habitat 3, the big conference on cities and sustainability in 2016. And it has a lot of the things that I think we all have been talking about and working towards for a long time: walkable mixed use, diversity, the sort of Jane Jacobs, mix of elements of the city and mix of people, diversity of people, diversity of activities, diversity of building types, diversity of affordability, all of these challenges that we're dealing with today that are, in the new urban agenda, and talking about equity and how do we achieve that? How do we create better quality cities? And I think what's happening right now is really interesting and important. It's along with the changes in our field, you're seeing changes in the sciences and a new understanding of cities as this sort of complex adaptive system that is partly self-organizing, partly organizing because of the people who are in the city co-creating it. And that's something that we as planners really need to get our arms around more than we have, certainly historically, to understand, as my friend Mike Batty says, that it's a contact system. It's a system that brings us together in space, a socio-spatial reactor, you might say, that allows us to benefit from the connections in the city. And yeah, we have digital and social networks, but we also need the physical spaces of the city on top of that, and in fact, maybe underlying that as a fundamental network. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And in many ways, this does go back to Jane Jacobs and that final chapter of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. If you don't know that work, I encourage you to read it. It's marvelous. Even though it was written in 1961, it's remarkably relevant today. And she talked about how our understanding of cities is changing. The science that is changing the way we understand cities, and understanding what I'm referring to as place networks. And I'll describe that in a little more detail later. But it's sort of a synthesis from a lot of different fields in the sciences, from anthropology, sociology, environmental psychology, neuroscience, and many other fields. And many other, of course, urbanists, Kevin Lynch and others, and Jacobs, as I mentioned. And I mentioned the Habitat 3 document, the New Urban Agenda. So as I said, the New Urban Agenda is, I think, a milestone because it does represent an international agreement that we need to reform the ways we've been planning and building cities, and in many ways, the ways we're still planning and building cities. And you will see in the New Urban Agenda language about well-connected, polycentric urban spatial frameworks, compactness and density, mixed use, public space networks, and so on. And that's, again, something that I think a lot of us have been working towards. So I think, again, this is an important milestone. And especially this idea about public spaces, the idea that we need networks of public space, not just little dollops of green here and there, but connective tissue, if you will, the streets, the public spaces that are all part of an interconnected system that bring us together in the city. And you'll see very similar language in the Sustainable Development Goals, which came out about the same time. And that's not an accident. The UN Habitat, our colleagues that we worked with, were very intent on getting some of the same language in both documents in Target 11.7 about cities. So again, you'll see a lot of information about a lot of description of the benefits of public space in the New Urban Agenda: social interaction and inclusion, human health and well-being, economic exchange, cultural expression, improving resilience, physical and mental health, air quality, sustainability, other things as well. And yet, at this moment in history, things are not going well for public spaces. In many cases, they're privatizing, they're becoming, sort of destroyed by auto-centric development. Even now, in many developing countries around the world, there's informal settlements and the impacts that they're having. And there's, sorry, this is cut off at the bottom, but there's also the inward turning shopping malls that are, privatizing public space. And also what's coming out of COVID, I think we have to be concerned about the fact that the pandemic may exacerbate the problems we already have of an over-encapsulated, high emissions, high depletion, high impact car dependent lifestyle, which is of course highly inequitable for those who can't drive, for the elderly, for the poor, for the young, for the infirm, and causing all kinds of impacts for those who do drive. So what we're learning from the research right now is really fascinating. The way that public space serves as a kind of network that affects the economic behavior of cities. That's part of the reason that cities have agglomeration benefits, as the research is showing, that when people form connections in the public spaces and the adjacent private spaces, the adjacent third places, they can have knowledge spillovers, as they're referred to. They can have the knowledge of how to develop new ideas, new creativity, new technologies, new businesses, new opportunities for people if they're immigrants or if they're climbing the rungs of the ladder, so to speak. And this is recent work by investigator Maria Roche, who showed that in fact the sort of Jane Jacobs lowly sidewalk does in fact have a strong component of providing the what are called the weak links, the weak connections between the people of the city that exchange new knowledge and new economic development, new opportunities. The strong links don't do that. The strong links of your family, the strong links of the people that you already work with, you're already hearing this, and this is true with social networks as well. You're already hearing a lot of the same things from them that you've heard before. But some new person that you meet because you've had a sort of incidental relationship, the serendipity and propinquity, as they say, that is actually a very, very important phenomenon in the city. And also we're learning that the resilience of cities and of neighborhoods is very, very closely tied to public space. Many of you probably know the work of Eric Kleinenberg, who's done some really leading work on what he calls social infrastructure. And the idea that when we are cut off from public spaces, we become isolated in our homes. We become much more vulnerable to illness, to catastrophic events like a heat wave. He studied the 1995 Chicago heat wave and a very seminal study showing that it was the sidewalks and the social infrastructure, the other third places and so on that are all interconnected with the sidewalks and the public spaces that allowed people to survive. And the places that didn't have those had a much higher mortality. And that was what he called one of the 4 key conditions of deaths from that heat wave, the degradation and fortification of urban public space. So this is literally an issue of life and death, it appears increasingly. And there's a lot more research on this and by Kleinenberg and others looking at this issue of resilience and public space and how important it is. There are many other benefits from public space that are coming out of the literature. My colleague Doug Kelbaugh writes a lot about the heat island issues and the fact that public space can mitigate that with greening and with albedo mitigations and so on, shade and comfort, reducing pavement area per person, reducing emissions per person, providing water infiltration zones, and many other benefits. Obviously, recreation, exercise, a sort of low carbon lifestyle that you can live when you have access to good quality public space and when you can walk through public space. So one of the things we've done at our center in Stockholm, where I've been based for the last 5 years or so, is to bring together a lot of the research in different disciplines, because what we found is that there is a lot of work on the benefits of public space, but they're all fragmented in different fields, and they haven't been brought together in any sort of coherent way, any way that we can begin to synthesize that research and translate it into practice in a useful way, and then translate the practice back into research with case studies and field research and so on. So this is something that's really badly needed, I think, and maybe some of you will go on into this area of research maybe in urban planning, urban design. Urban design is my field, by the way. I have my PhD in architecture, but I also teach urban planning. So I think we can recognize that these issues are increasingly important and we can bring these together. And so one of the things we have done at our center is to begin to map those indicators that are in the new urban agenda. And, there's language in there that seems very aspirational about we envisage cities and human settlements that are participatory, promote civic engagement and so on. But how do you actually make those very precise, measurable indicators and metrics? And so that's what we did in this paper. We began to tease out what those sort of proto indicators would be and how we would actually begin to assess those. And so I think this is ongoing work, and I think it's really very important work for understanding not only in the broad sort of theoretical perspective of the importance of public space, but in a concrete, measurable way. How do we measure what's going on? Who has access to public space? What are the barriers to using it? What are the qualities of the public space? Not all public space is the same, of course. So we desperately need those indicators. But let's take a moment to assess where we are at this moment in history. And I think we have reason to be very alarmed. This is a map of Beijing in 2000, and this is a map of Beijing in 2010, 10 years later. And what you see is that the urban extent of the city has increased fourfold, but the population of the city has not increased fourfold. It's increased a much smaller amount, which means that density is going down and sprawl is going up, and emissions are going up, and depletion is going up, and all the other phenomena. And again, I apologize, this got cut off at the bottom, but we are on track to produce more urban fabric over the first half of the 20th century than we have in all of human history, which is a staggering thought. And it makes us recognize, I think it clarifies the challenge for us to reform our failing practices, in many ways, our early 20th century practices that are based too much around the car and around, mechanical systems, encapsulation. And so, yes, rapid urbanization is proceeding rapidly, and we have to be clear, not all of it is bad news. Some of it is certainly some of it is sprawling and resource efficient. If you look at right around the world, in Asia and Europe and South America and Africa, explosive growth of informal settlements as well, explosive growth of market rate developments, which are have their own set of problems from emissions and from again, the lack of access for the elderly and for the infirm and for the poor, people who can't drive, who can't access this system the way it's set up. And also the issue of sustainability, which is a grave challenge right now, that we have to be careful with what's known as Jevons paradox. The idea that the more you make energy efficient, the more people will use the energy because it gets cheaper. More efficient means it's cheaper, means you use more of it and you lose the benefits. And we're in many cases, we have problems that are becoming exacerbated by these sort of rebound effects, as they're called. And we have to take a broader systems approach to these challenges. And I think we have to recognize that some of the sort of futuristic ideas that we might have been relying upon too much, and I think some of our friends in the smart cities movement need to temper their enthusiasm for some of these new technologies by remembering that maybe these systems are not going to perform quite as intended. This, by the way, is the Ainara Tower that was planned for Dubai. It's actually been canceled, but this is supposed to be an iconic green skyscraper, an iconic sustainable skyscraper. But notice that it's an all glass building facing into the sun, right? And so it's enormous heat gain. And then it has this propeller that was supposedly, meant to appear to generate energy, but it was purely decorative. It wasn't even intended to be a real propeller generating energy. So we have to recognize there's a lot of greenwashing in these technologies, and there's a lot of fantasy and a lot of magical thinking, if you will. And we have to temper that with a much more realistic approach to these challenges, I think. And we need to recognize the urgent need to overcome poverty and its ills and not minimize that problem. We can't just say, well, we don't want to have urbanization, because urbanization is improving the quality of life for many, many people, medicines and sanitation and access to better quality foods and so on. But I think we have to avoid what you might call the crack cocaine, if you will, of economic development, which is what we're getting right now. It's producing a lot of economic growth, but very rapid urban growth, and then followed by a collapse potentially. And we're getting sprawl in the periphery and gentrification in the core. And we need to recognize that somehow we need to go back to this quote from Mike Batty to understand what cities can give us to do a better job at optimizing what it is that cities can give us when they're working at their best. And here's an example of that. I'll give you, this is something that I used in my own research on greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a chart of relative greenhouse gas emissions per capita from different countries and also different cities within those countries. And what you'll notice is, first of all, here's New York City, and here's the US average, which includes, much more sprawling cities and regions. And it's about 3 times greater in the US as a whole than in New York City, because everything is more compact, right? It makes sense. But if you look at Sweden as a country, that is also about 3 times less high emissions than the United States. And Stockholm, again, is about twice as low, or Sweden as a region is about twice as high as Stockholm as a city. And then when you look at Stockholm compared to the average city or suburb or region of the United States, it's about a 6-fold increase. So what can account for that enormous magnitude? It can't be accounted for by culture, certainly by climate. Sweden is a cold climate. It's even requires more energy in many ways. It has some advantages with geothermal and steam systems and so on. It has some, but the main ingredient, the main factor that is clear is urban form, the ability to be more compact, certainly. So yes, density is a factor, and you can see that just by bringing the elements of a city together and having a more compact city, you're going to have less requirement for transportation, less requirement for infrastructure, less transmission losses, all the other things. And that is indeed a big factor. And so we do see that that density is strongly correlated with emissions per capita. In fact, if you look at these two maps, the map on the left is greenhouse gas emissions per capita. It actually is based on transportation, but other household contributions are similar. And the darker green is the lowest emission, and the red is the highest emission. And then you look at the map on the right, and that is the density, and the red is the highest density, and the blue is the lowest density. And look at that, you'll see that there's a beautiful inverse correlation. The highest density is the lowest emission, the lowest density is the highest emission in the East Bay there. Quite a remarkable inverse correlation, as you can see. But it is not just the density, but we have to look at the other factors of urban morphology that impact on greenhouse gas emissions and on other resource use and consumption and other things. For example, a mix of destinations and uses, connectivity, multimodal transportation, compact housing, and so on. Because if you look, for example, at the East Bay area, the area in central San Francisco. This is actually where I used to live when I was going to school at Berkeley. I lived up on the top of that building over there next to the Searchlight Market. And again, you see a very walkable mixed use pattern. That was my market that was, practically in my building, next building over. Multimodal transportation, not only the streetcar, but buses that run every couple of blocks. Very compact gridded form, smaller homes that are still very livable, I'll tell you. Actually, that's my apartment right up there, you can see, in fact. And a wonderful place to live, very desirable place to live. In fact, it's becoming very expensive. And then over in the East Bay, where you see higher emissions, well, not surprisingly, you see the same sort of mid-20th century model of a car-dependent, low-density, sprawling elements segregated out, zoned, segregated zoning, functional segregation, and so on. And lo and behold, that is the pattern that we've been building over the last 50 years. And it is not only environmental impacts, but also economic impacts. And this map on the upper left is a map of the foreclosures from the 2008 financial crisis, the mortgage meltdown, if you recall. And what you see is that the places that have the biggest mortgage foreclosure are the ones out in the exurbs, farther out, the sort of drive till you qualify suburbs and exurbs. And the core areas, the older traditional neighborhoods that are more walkable and mixed, have much lower rates by comparison. And you see this consistently over and over with many, many cities around the United States and indeed around the world. And this was what caused the global financial meltdown in 2008. So this is a huge economic issue on top of everything else. So in my own research, I looked at the different factors contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a long story, but just to summarize, in the neighborhood of something like 30% or more of greenhouse gas emissions is attributable to urban form. It actually might be much, much higher than that, but those are the ones that we can clearly document, and as I was able to do in my research. So this is a huge, huge factor when you're talking about the urban form, and whether we're sprawling or whether we're more compact and walkable and mixed. And by the way, I'm not just talking about jamming people into sort of, filing cabinet urbanism. I'm talking about very livable, beautiful places. I'm in Paris right now, and Paris is a fantastic city to live. It's very, in fact, very expensive because it's such a fantastic place to live. And it's also extremely dense. It's probably denser than most of the cities in the United States. And Amsterdam too, this is Amsterdam on the right, has not only a high compactness and high livability, but also a choice architecture. This is a term that comes from behavioral economics, that we have different choices in that environment on the right. We can ride our bike, we can walk, we can stop off at the healthy little store right around the corner and get good quality food and so on. But in the neighborhood on the left, this is San Antonio, Loop 410, if you all know that city. You're not going to walk there. You'd be crazy to, right? Or bike. You're going to be in your car. And if you're hungry, you're going to drive through because that's the convenient thing to do. It's all set up for that. Your choice architecture is set up for a completely different consumption pattern, lifestyle, behavior, level of exercise, level of obesity, level of consumption, meat eating, packaging, et cetera, all of those things that become multipliers in that kind of environment. But let's be clear, this was something that we thought, quite mistakenly, was a rational choice to move from the messy and sort of chaotic and unsanitary traditional city on the right, where everything was sort of on top of everything else, and animals and people, et cetera, to a nicely segregated, functionally ordered, rationally planned city on the left, which is what San Antonio is, by the way. It's that model, basically. It's the model of a major arterial with all of the functions pulled away into buildings that have, they're maybe much nicer visually than San Antonio is today, but it's essentially the same model. And so this is something that Saskia Sassen, Richard Sennett, Ricky Burdett, and Joan Clos, who was the Secretary General of Habitat 3, wrote about, is the famous Charter of Athens, which described this model on the left as something that we should all build our cities according to. And they are noting that, in fact, the New Urban Agenda is a reversal of that, and that we must reframe the discourse and practice of planning. And we must avoid or reform this, if you will, rationally segregated approach to cities, pulling all of our urban elements apart to encapsulate us all in the capsule of our home, going to the capsule of our workplace, connected by the capsule of our car. And there is no mixing with other people. There is no public space. There is no propinquity and serendipity. It's all based upon these capsules and these very, very high consumption, high impact lifestyles that we're leading in these kinds of capsules. But again, this was the model. This is Norman Belgetti's, if you know his work from the World's Fair, the 1939 World's Fair, which was taking this essentially radiant city model and elevating it to something that became really a blueprint for the way that we built. This is Dallas, but it could be many different cities. I'm sure parts of Milwaukee and parts of just about any other American city as well, right? So I come back again to this idea. Let's talk about the idea of the networks again and what's happening in our cities, not only in the if you will, the spatial networks, but also the experience of the quality of place. And I'll just touch on some fascinating research that my colleague Nikos Salingaros and I've been working on, which is the presence of symmetry in the built environment is something that we actually, there's some really interesting work in neuroscience and in environmental ecology and other fields that seems to suggest that symmetry and the forms that it takes in terms of natural structures and vegetation and what's called biophilia, you've probably heard that term. Those are things that we crave, and we need to have those if we're going to have walkable, mixed, lively public spaces. And the spaces that we've been creating, unfortunately, are too much like that one on the right. These are both in London, by the way. They're only about a mile apart from one another. And yet the model on the right was something that people thought was a good idea. They thought it was more modern and more sophisticated, strange to say. And so we've been, this relates to biophilia and so on, how symmetry, and by the way, symmetry is not just left and right, the mirror symmetry or reflectional symmetry. It's also rotation. It's also what's called translational symmetry, the patterns that repeat. It's also scaling symmetry, patterns that are the same at different scales and so on. And then also the way those combine, things like the fractal patterns and the beauty of a kaleidoscope, for example, and many natural environments combine different forms of symmetry. And what we refer to as deep symmetry, the idea that we need to experience in our built environments a sense of connection to other structures, whether they're literally human sculptures, for example, that we feel our own bodies in relationship to them in a symmetry with them, or a beautiful landscape, we feel ourselves sort of on the ground and experiencing the earth and the sort of power of that, or a sort of landscape, buildings that position themselves in the landscape in a very beautiful way and create these sort of different qualities of symmetry, rotational symmetry, and so on. And of course, the structure of the human face has lots of symmetries, not only the bilateral symmetry, the reflectional symmetry, but again, rotational symmetry and translational symmetry, the lashes of the eyebrow or the eyelashes, and so on. And these are all really important characteristics in our built environment that I think we have not recognized enough in the importance. And this is a quote from a neurobiologist at University College London who's surveyed some of the MRI studies and other neuroscience, including some of his own group there. And he says that we seek a certain quality in the environment, what we call beauty. We refer to it as beauty, but what it is actually is something going on in our brains, a neurobiological phenomenon. And beauty has to be whatever you want to call it, whether you call it beauty or other experiences, it has to be there. It's not a luxury, but what he calls an essential ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain, which I think is a really interesting idea, and I think an important idea when we're thinking about the quality of our environments for the human beings that we're working with and for the experiences that they're going to have in those environments, and whether they're going to walk and whether they're going to have spend time in public spaces because they feel good there, whether they're going to have well-being in those public spaces or feel stress conversely and want to leave them or whatever. And so the research is showing that yes, there are socially constructed aspects of beauty, but there are also very clearly common biological roots to what we experience as beautiful or aesthetically desirable places and structures. And if you will, it's you might think of it as the branches of a tree coming from a common trunk, that we all share a common biological basis. We all have the same kinds of bodies and brains and evolutionary history and so on. But then, yes, there's some social construction that takes that out, differentiates that into other more exotic realms. And we just have to be careful about the fact that some of those are maybe outliers from where most people are most of the time. And if those people are our users, if we're designers or professionals, planners, then we have to be careful about our own professional responsibility, right? We're not just designing for ourselves or for each other. We're designing for the public, for all those people. So I think we have to recognize as professionals and as specialists that we have to temper our social constructions when we're doing architectural, exotic architectural designs or whatever they may be, and make sure that they are grounded in a common sort of biological sense of beauty and that promotes people's well-being and people's success and willingness to be in public spaces and to enjoy public spaces.
Michael,
And
there's an interesting question, as you talk about a lot of these spaces and the nourishing of our mental and well-being. Are there examples that are more affordable or ways to improve cities that don't make them more expensive? I mean, you've shown a lot of great examples, but I think there's a reaction to them being in sort of expensive places to live. So if you have any examples that you can offer, that would be great. Thank you.
That's a hugely important topic. And of course, first of all, I think we all recognize that if it's true that beauty is not a luxury, but an ingredient in nourishing the emotional brain, then it's not something that we should be happy to have only for the wealthy, right? It's something that we should find ways to promote in all communities of the city. And it doesn't mean that you spend a lot of money getting it. I mean, there's beauty in human activity. There's beauty in the artwork that children make. There's beauty in, sunshine and water and plants, things that don't necessarily cost a lot of money. But there is the larger question that I think you allude to, which is that we have not done a good job of creating a lot of equitable places for human beings. And I think this is another topic. Let me see if I can jump ahead a little bit. No, let me go. I'll stay with this. But what I want to touch on just in response to your question is that I think it's essential. We do know that there's an issue of supply and demand, right? And that certainly we need more supply of housing, for example, to meet demand. But it's not just any housing anywhere. We need to be, because housing is always location sensitive. This real estate has three most important factors: are location, location, location. And so I think we in the planning world have done a bad job being truly polycentric. We've gotten this model of just pushing people out to the periphery, drive till you qualify, right? Instead of saying, wait a minute, let's make sure that those places are also more compact, more walkable, more, and there's a number of tools that we can use to do that. Obviously, zoning reform is one of those, and a lot of zoning reform is going on now to make more mixed use zones, even in the suburbs and in the exurbs, and to provide more economic opportunities in those places. I was talking about coming here to Paris, and what's happened in Paris is that the suburbs around Paris, they're called the banlieues, and they have become essentially bedroom communities, monocultures of residential tower blocks, very sort of monolithic and not diverse at all. And this is where many of the immigrants end up. And they don't have opportunities there. There's no work for them there. They can't get to work very easily. And there've been enormous problems in the banlieues there. And yet at the same time, the central city of Paris is very expensive because we have focused too much upon the cores and upon this sort of idea, you might call it the voodoo urbanism instead of voodoo economics. The idea of voodoo economics was that you just give the wealthy people good opportunities and they'll generate all the wealth and it'll trickle down to everybody else. Well, we're sort of doing that with cities and saying we're going to give the cores a lot of economic power and a lot of economic, concentration, and that's going to trickle down to everybody else. And what we know from network theory, this is a good segue into this slide, actually. What we know from network theory is that what's known as a rich club network, and that comes from the idea of a rich club of people who know each other and who are wealthy and who know how to create economic power, right? Well, in network theory, that idea is simply that there's certain nodes of any network that tend to be more active and more productive in generating connections and doing powerful things. But you as a planner or you as a manager of that network need to be careful not to over concentrate, not to put all your eggs in one basket, but to create more of those polycentric rich clubs, if you will, to create more opportunities for more people in different parts of the city, including the suburbs and the exurbs and the immigrant communities and so on. And rather than just focusing too much on the cores and on the rich club networks and trying to maybe jam a lot more people into those cores, thinking that that's what's going to create equity, because it doesn't work. It actually just creates more, a spiral of increasing cost. And you've seen that, for example, in Vancouver, BC, where they tried desperately to build their way to affordability in the downtown area, especially. My friend Patrick Condon at the University of British Columbia has done some really interesting work on this, and I think very important. What he's talked about, he wrote a book called Sick City, SICKCITY, if you want to look that up. Very interesting and I think important subject. But I want to, while I've got about another, I don't want to go more than about 15 minutes here. So let me turn back to public space for a moment and talk about public space and what is increasingly we're recognizing is the structure of public space. It's not just one thing. It's not just like dollops of green around, right? It's a particular kind of structure of spatial relationships that people have within the spaces. And I'm going to describe that briefly here. So public space, first of all, is the kind of platform for connecting all the other spaces of the city. You might say ultimately what a city is a public space platform that brings together all these private and semi-public spaces that otherwise would just be out in the countryside scattered around, right? They come together and they connect to each other through the public spaces. Just knocked my headphones off, sorry. And that's very important to recognize that public space is that platform. And there are ways I think we recognize coming out of the COVID pandemic to maintain good quality public spaces with what I have referred to as sociable distancing, the sort of the humble front porch. This is actually my daughter and a couple of grandkids there, and I'm walking by. And the point is that I'm able to connect with them socially, even though we're safe from one another. My daughter actually has COVID right now, as a matter of fact. So we can still connect. They can still connect. If you remember Eric Kleinenberg's work, somebody who has that tissue of connections between the private and the public is able to be more interconnected with their neighbors. And this is something that I think we need to recognize about public space, that it needs to protect us as well as to connect us, not just to connect us. It needs to exclude as well as to include. And I'll give you an example of that. Before I do, I want to touch on this 15-minute cities concept briefly, and just illustrate with this example that we have to be clear, I think, what we mean by 15 minutes. Is it 15 minutes of driving, 15 minutes of walking, 15 minutes of whatever? And I think what we're saying by the 15-minute concept, I'm looking forward to talking to Carlos Moreno about this, by the way, is that most things that you need most of the time, you can get to within 15 minutes of actually walking or maybe biking, and you don't need a car. I think that's what we're aiming for. And this is a diagram that shows that, most of the trips that we take are short trips, to the store, to the school, maybe to our workplace. Hopefully it's not a long commute. And then we maybe have longer trips less frequently. Maybe we go into the big city or across town, or even to another town, maybe once or twice a month, something like that. So we're trying to cluster those trips in this range of the 15-minute zone of daily needs and destinations, and maybe even a 5-minute zone that's even tighter still than that we can walk to the proverbial quart of milk or whatever. And this is the idea of a polycentric city, I think, or polycentric region, that all of these different regions have within their own neighborhoods, their own region, that 15-minute zone that people can get around, or the 5-minute zone even. And then, yeah, they can get to the big city, or they can get across town. You don't need to go. If I'm living in one of the arrondissements here in Paris, I don't need to get to the Eiffel Tower every day, back and forth, back and forth. I maybe do that once every couple of weeks or something. So I think we have to recognize the self-organization of cities around travel, which in many ways was sort of blown out by the automobile and by our automobile-based 20th century planning models, functionally segregated zoning and so on. And you remember Jane Jacobs was talking about, those of you who've read Jacobs, I hope you all have, and please do if you haven't. In the last chapter, she was talking about how we've gone scientifically from 2 variable problems to statistical problems of many variables where you don't really know how the variables are interconnected, but we've missed the range of organized complexity, as she referred to it, the range where you have variables that might not be a lot of variables, but the key issue is that they're interconnected with each other in this web network, interconnected into an organic whole, as she put it. And that's what happens in the neighborhood, in most places and most spaces as well, where we live and where we go about our activities. And Herbert Simon described this when he was talking about the architecture of complexity, that you can decompose a design problem or a physical structure of the city into almost a hierarchy, a nearly decomposable hierarchy, but you still have these web network relationships, these overlaps. And Christopher Alexander had a very similar idea, which was the genesis of his idea of pattern languages, that you have these critical overlaps, these semi-lattices, as he referred to them, and they form clusters when they're tightly interrelated with each other, and those are what he referred to as patterns. Bruno Latour, who you may know, has developed something called actor network theory, the sociologist, talks about how in our environments, in our cities, in our lives, we have this web of relationships between actors, and the actor can be not just people, it can be places or things, and the network of connections between them. This understanding of cities as networks, as spatial networks especially, is very, very important, I think, and very exciting. And the idea that we have this network of third places and third things, as Latour was talking about. For example, the idea that if you have a dog, that is a third object or third actor that allows you to connect with a stranger in a very comfortable way, rather than just walking up to a stranger cold and saying, "Oh, hello, my name is so-and-so." That would be very awkward, right? And the same thing in a third place as well. So these things happen in public spaces and in the adjacent private spaces that are so important. And they happen in this overlapping, interconnected way, as Christopher Alexander talked about with his great paper called "A City Is Not a Tree." And in the time that I have left, I'm just going to take I have about 10 minutes that I want to wrap this up. I want to describe, as I build at the beginning, this idea of a place network, which brings together a lot of the ideas of Kevin Lynch and Bruno Latour and Jane Jacobs and a number of others, Christopher Alexander. So let me explain this idea with this illustration. This is a street right around the corner from where I used to live in London. And it's a montage that shows you how the sort of streetscape continued. And what you'll notice about this environment is that there are many different places where people can be, and they can be in groups or in clusters or in room-like spaces, literally rooms in some cases, and they can see, or some cases hear, or maybe see but not hear if it's through the glass, or hear but not see if it's through the vegetation. And so there's connections, and they can move as well. They can walk down the sidewalk, and they can walk down the up the stairs to their room, and so on. So if you map it out as a network, it's a really dizzying interconnected web. And this is only some of the more obvious elements of that web network. And this is actually what's going on all the time in our public spaces and our adjoining private spaces, that we have the literal rooms from the most private, like our bedrooms and so on, to the maybe more public, the parlor, the front room where you would receive visitors, and then the outdoor space, but still in your yard or your stoop, and then the public space right out in front. Maybe it's the sidewalk or the area right out in front of your home or your street. And these are all room-like spaces. They all have the ability to control how connected we are. We can close a door or open a window or make a change, draw the blinds, whatever. We can remodel those places. We can gradually transform those places over time, that place network and the connections that exist. We can build another door, a gateway, or remove a gateway. I went back to that same place 7 years later, and what I noticed is you can see in the lower area there, they've built these new fences. They've created terraces up above there. Both of those owners of those flats have, and then somebody has put a couple of planters to sort of demarcate that stoop where they are entering. The sidewalk cafe is gone for some reason. Maybe it's the time of year, I don't know. But gradually these things are transforming over time in a really fascinating and important way, I think, in terms of the placemaking. And this goes back to the point about, it doesn't have to be expensive. If you give people the power to change their own environments and to do it in, fairly modest ways that can be, a little bit of paint, a little bit of fencing, a little bit of signage or awnings or whatever, and so on. And this is what goes on in all great cities to some degree, maybe even more dramatically over many, many more years. For example, this is a cadastral plan of Venice, the one on the left, and this is a famous study by Muratori. And what you see on the right is exactly the same place, and it has become incredibly more differentiated, more complex, more intricate, with lots of new spaces. Here I'm going to show it as a sort of time lapse, the exact same place. And somebody has been, or many people have been, transforming those plots, those simple cadastral plots, into these very complex tissues, getting permission from the Doge, getting contracting out and making the changes, building, and so on, incrementally building up the fantastic city that we all know and love. And that goes on in informal settlements too, quite remarkably, I think. The great hill towns of Italy and great urbanism all over the world that's often built by people, architecture without architects, as Bernard Rudofsky called it, that can be quite sophisticated in its organization. And here in Medellin, Colombia, they did something very interesting where they took an informal settlement that was in very sad shape, and they transformed it by coming in. The neighborhood itself voted with what's called participatory budgeting to build a new escalator system coming up, much safer, much more sanitary. They have stewards that can protect people and, call in case there's trouble, and all the other things that were catalyzed around that. More vegetation, more artwork, more little shops that opened up, and so on. So I think I'm going to try to wrap it up so we have time for a little bit of discussion. But I think you begin to see that if we understand public space, not just as one big undifferentiated thing, but as a real sort of tissue of places that have these room-like qualities, these sort of membrane-like qualities then you begin to see in all great cities, if you travel around, you'll see these fantastic spaces. And these are, by the way, these have aesthetic aspects to them also. The umbrellas that are very beautiful are sort of defining those room-like spaces. Vegetation that's very beautiful is helping to define those spaces. And this is in Portland, just down the street from where I used to live, some old houses that have been transformed into a very popular retail district. And once again, you see this sort of tissue of public and semi-public and private spaces. And you're seeing it with the adaptations to the pandemic. This is in Portland also. This is a street that's been taken over. It had a bike lane in the middle of it, and it had a car lane next to it. And because the traffic was much lower, they just took that over and turned it into a outdoor seating area for actually two different restaurants on either side. It's a wonderful place. I stay there whenever I can. And of course, the parklets that we've all seen, those are literally room-like spaces, right, that are being taken over for dining and so on to protect people from COVID. Again, to protect us in public space as well as to connect us. And I think we need to recognize that this is going on all the time, and that we must do a better job of it, because here it is in let's say 1900, and here it is in 2010 or so. This is buildings from the L'Aquila earthquake in the same part of Italy, or near another part of Italy. And you see there is no tissue of public and private. There is no differentiation. Here's Oslo in 1910. Here's Oslo in 2010. Again, no differentiation, no tissue, and clearly not a walkable public realm, not anything like what we would consider beauty, I don't think. And yet somebody designed that building and thought that it was a nice design. And I'm sure they were happy with what they had come up with. And somebody who designed all those logos, and somebody who designed all those, the signage and everything. But clearly there is something missing from this approach. And I think what it is this failure to understand the larger holes that we're creating in public space, the tissue of public spaces and private spaces that need to be reflected in our architecture as much as in our other structures as well. And again, this quality of biophilia that we see not only in literal vegetation, but often we see it in the buildings themselves that include things like people and animals and acanthus leaves and so on. And this is in Glasgow, Scotland. Again, a very interesting articulated realm from public to private, and a very complex tissue of connective relationship. So I'll leave you on that note that I think we need to think differently about public space. We need to recognize how important public space is. And we need to, I think, recognize that if we're going to achieve the goals of the Sustainable Development goals and the new urban agenda and the other things that I think we're all increasingly recognizing are urgent, then we're going to have to change the way we think about our roles as planners and as designers to create not so much plan for an end condition, but plan for empowering a process, empowering the people themselves to partially co-create those networks of public and private space.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's such a rich body of research that you've been able to provide that also emphasizes the importance of this. I have a question. When we look at the importance of all the layering of activities and programming of public space, and you show a lot of rich layers from landscape to the outdoor dining. Do you have any research or experience talking a little bit more about the tactical urbanism and how communities that might be resistant to some of these ideas are embracing it more by trying it out essentially through
Yeah, I just touched at the end on some of the tactical urbanism things that have happened as a result of COVID. And I think that's a really powerful strategy to, some of you may be familiar with the Better Block, which is the program to make temporary changes to widen sidewalks and narrow streets and introduce, sometimes they're done with planters. And that's just one example of a tactical urbanism approach where it creates a level of comfort for the store owners and the stakeholders of the neighborhood to say, look, if this doesn't work out, if this is a disaster, we can take these things away, overnight, and it's not a permanent change. But if you really like it and you want it to become permanent, we can work on that, and that's exactly what has happened in many cases. It's quite remarkable the way, and I think that's the way environments change anyway, right? They do gradually change, sometimes temporarily, and then the temporary things become more permanent. And I think rather than just bulldoze and start over, making these incremental tactical changes is a powerful way, especially when you're dealing with an existing neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it takes a little bit of the risk off, and where there might be fear about the change.
Right.
I remember in my practice, we've done that with one ways converting to two ways, where you just try it out.
Right.
So there,
Exactly.
for everybody who's still on, please do look at the link that Jenny posted for our survey. But there's another question about the impact that some of the sort of temporary but additional items might have on accessibility. Obviously when we crowd too much with tables and parklets, there's an issue with people being dropped off from a handicap perspective and overall accessibility. Is that something that you've seen different solutions for?
Yeah, I think that, again, that's a retrofitting issue that has to be dealt with. And if you're talking about, are you speaking specifically of retrofits or?
Well, the comment in the chat is specifically talking about parklets, reducing curbside access for paratransit drop-offs,
Yeah,
or reduced parking, probably
Right.
more in the retrofits. I know that the cities and zoning are changing now in terms of Uber drop-off and loading drop-off,
Right,
so that's
right.
changing.
Well, of course, the whole question of AVs is looming out there. What if it's coming? What is that going to mean in terms of all of these things? And it's a huge question mark. I take the commenter's point that a lot of these are familiar ideas that we've all been talking about for a long time. But let's be realistic. They're not changing enough, especially in other parts of the world. And even in our world, if we're looking at the urban environments, the urban cores, they're changing perhaps more positively. But suburbs around the country, I can tell you firsthand, are still growing by leaps and bounds as sprawling car-dependent suburbs with maybe a little bit of lifestyle, shopping mall and this and that. So I think we have to recognize, first of all, that although these are things we've all been talking about for a long time, the strategies for implementation are still not there, or at least they haven't. We haven't implemented them in many places around the country. And some of my work, and I suspect, Carolyn, some of your work, is working with those jurisdictions to do the zoning code reforms, to do the handicapped and accessible reforms, to do all of these things that we've been talking about for a long time. And it's heavy lifting. It's not a snap. And I do think, though, that it requires us to think differently, as I've been alluding to, about what we're aiming for. We're not just aiming for specific goals in isolation. We're not aiming for silver bullets. We have to aim for a larger sort of transformation, which is a different way of thinking about our role as planners, I think. So I don't know if I've completely answered the commenter's question, but certainly there's a lot going on in that field and in others for those who are retrofitting existing places. So
I think there's a combination solution there between design and regulation. So there's another question. Can you list a few cities that have strong policies that lead to better networks of the public spaces? So I know you mentioned a couple highlights like San Antonio.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few. I mean, everybody to some degree, I think, is trying to do this. I think Carolyn, I suspect you see the same thing. When I travel around and work with different jurisdictions, everybody's we need to change our ways. The question is, how do you do it, and how do you actually drive the change? And I mentioned this conference that we're going to do here in a suburb of Paris, the International Making Cities Livable, it's called. We go to a place that has done this, and we try to learn the lessons from them. And we bring people who have done it in other places, and we try to share those lessons. What tools did you use? What regulatory changes? What financial tools? What design tools? What was your toolkit, and how do you share those? So, for example, Carmel, Indiana, it's not a very widely known example, but it's a really remarkable example of a suburban retrofit from a sprawling, sort of typical American car-dominated suburb to at least partially a much richer, walkable place with those kinds of place networks that I'm describing, because I think they trusted the process and allowed the process, maybe not perfectly, but this is all about learning and sharing lessons. And I think they did a very good job of it. I think the place here in Paris is called Le Plessis Robinson, which was a former banlieue of all housing, and it has been transformed into a much more diverse, walkable, mixed place with a lot of very rich place networks, as I refer to them. There are many other examples that obviously the places that have been most successful, I think, are the ones that have the sort of the bones already there, and they can recover it. The inner city areas that we've seen have a renaissance over the last 20 or 30 years that have become, very successful to a fault, right? They've become gentrified, unfortunately, but they've certainly tipped over from being essentially depressed areas into becoming much more vibrant areas, and then tipping over again into becoming more gentrified areas. So, and by the way, this is a really important point. I think that there's an idea that I think Jacobs alludes to, the idea that you want maximum diversity. You don't want to tip over into becoming an enclave of wealth or gentrification, but you also don't want to stay a slum, right? You want to create what you call unslumming. You want to have opportunities for people somewhere in the middle here, the Goldilocks zone, if you will, of urbanism that allows you to maintain opportunities for people and not tip over into what Jacobs referred to as the self-destruction of diversity. And I think, again, it requires us to have a toolkit approach to do that, to work with the economic development folks and the regulatory folks and the design folks and others, and obviously in the public sector and also the nonprofit NGO sector and the private sector to create a culture that achieves that kind of place. And I think the most successful examples have done that.
I think that's so true. It's all about partnerships and collaboration, right? Because you need the champions when the regulators and designers move on, right? So helping that to be implemented. Right. So I think we can start to gather a list of these cities as well. I think we'll do a little research, as you talked about the international, what did you call it? Making cities livable. Take a look at that.
And you can go on. I'll just give a little plug here. imcl.online. imcl.online. And there's information about the Paris conference, and also the videos from the Carmel conference, or I can actually send you a link, Carolyn, if you want to pass that on.
That would be great. I think Jenny just posted it. I think
great.
there's other research right now on the second tier legacy cities, and because there's always that question that we had earlier about the affordability. Atlanta has this great network and Austin has a great network, but as you mentioned, there's other cities in Indiana and Ohio that we have great examples here in Madison and Milwaukee. So really appreciate you spending some time with us, especially as I can see it's dark there now in Paris. So I wish you well at your conference, and thank you to everybody who's attended and is still with us. Reminder that I hope to see you online at our next event, which is April 6th, and then hopefully see you in person on April 22nd here on campus. So again, thank you to Dr. Mehaffy for joining us. And have a good time as you move to your conference.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.